Well, Mark, thank you so much for having a chat with us. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, delighted to be with you. Thanks, Laura.
This report that you've created, The Future of the Church in Australia, why did you feel like it was time to check in on the church and check in how Australia are responding to the Christian faith?
Well, it's been a year like no other, perhaps like no other in more than a century for the church. I mean, we've all been dealing with COVID and the pandemic and social isolating and working from home and that has impacted people spiritually. It's impacted people from a fear and uncertainty and worry perspective. And then you add in the fact that suddenly, almost overnight, churches had to cease gathering, doors were closed, ministries couldn't connect in the way they did. And we're all back to house churches, something we really haven't seen perhaps since the first century. So it was just next level for the church, and this comes at a time as well when Australians have been declining in their adherence to Christianity, and there's been some recent years of challenge for the church around the Royal Commission and issues around the place of the church in Australia. So so much for church and ministry leaders to deal with, and therefore we thought it was a good time to look at the church in Australia and its future. And this was commissioned by an organisation who wanted to dig deeper into that as well. So it really was, I think, the right report for the right time.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of Christian leaders and organizations that have any kind of affiliation with the Christian faith are going to find it so helpful because it gives us such a picture of the community that we're really trying to speak into. And with that in mind, how many Australians did say that they are Christian or regularly attend church? Because we often hear that Christianity is on the decline in Australia, but is that the case?
Well, that's a really interesting one. Christianity, in terms of our identity nationally, has been declining. In the last 10 years of census results, the proportion of Australians saying their religion is Christianity has declined from 64% to 52%. And our own research is saying it's probably just slipped below that 50% mark. So Christianity nationally is now in minority share. However, that's, if you like, a general sense of what's my religion. It doesn't actually capture people's practice and those who might be churchgoers. In fact, the National Church Life Survey data shows that over the same period of time, the proportion of Australians attending church regularly has been unchanged, about 15 to 16% of our nation. So while there's been, I guess, the evaporation of what you might call cultural Christianity, historic Christianity, Christianity is your identity, like I'm an Australian and I guess my grandparents were Christian, so I guess I'm that, that's faded. But the core of those who say, no, Christianity is my faith, it's my walk, and I'm a churchgoer, is actually unchanged.
It's really encouraging to hear that, but we do know that for the people who aren't Christian or who don't attend church, there's probably some kind of barrier. There's a reason as to why that is. What did your report show some of those barriers to be?
We've looked at this over a number of years, the blockers, the belief blockers that stop Australians who otherwise are exploring issues of faith from engaging with Christianity and particularly the church. And number one of those issues is church abuse, and people have, and they're right for having this perception that the church has been a place of abuse, abuse of power. And we've seen some of that laid bare in recent years with the Royal Commission, as I mentioned. Hypocrisy is number two, and there's no end of hearing the stories of church leaders and ministry organisations that have said one thing, but suddenly there's alternate practices going on. Even just the history of religious wars, historic and indeed current, that can be a hang up for people saying, well, isn't Christianity just causing conflict in the world? The judging of others, the old Christians are Bible bashers, it was fourth on the list. And fifth is issues around money, where there is a perception that church ministries are always rattling the can and churches are really about the offering or the tithe, and that's a key motivator. These are some perceptions, we would say misconceptions, but nonetheless they're realities that Australians have as they think about the church.
They are factors that you have to deal with. And it means, as you've mentioned, that there's a real social and cultural shift away from the identity that Australia had right from the First Fleet as a Christian nation. So for modern day church leaders, as they are wanting to plant churches, they're wanting to engage with their communities, what are some of the social and cultural shifts that we really do have to be aware of to make sure that we're connecting with the Australia that exists now, not the one of the past or the one that we'd hope for it to look like?
Well, that's such a great point, and the church can't rely on the fact that in the past, most Australians identified as Christians because, as we said, that's changed. We are one of the most culturally diverse nations on the planet. That has changed a lot in the last couple of generations, to the point now where almost a third of us was born overseas, 29%. Which is far more than we see in comparable nations like the US or the UK. In cities like Sydney and Melbourne, you've got up to half of the residents of the cities, the inner cities there, speaking a language other than English at home. Even in the city of Brisbane, it's a quarter of all residents speaking a non-English language at home. So we're linguistically diverse. We've got generational change, 6 generations in Australia. And we might understand the baby boomers and Gen X, but what about the millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha? So connecting across the diversity of our society is key. We found in our research that one of the issues Australians have of the church, I mentioned 5 of them, but another one is issues around women, the role of women. And I think the church has a bit to solve there as well. Particularly because more than half of our national population are females, and more than half, well over half of the church-going population are. And so the role of women in leadership and in ministry roles and being empowered in the church and in ministries is important as well. So these were some of the factors that our church leaders in this study really delved into and looked at and really focused on dealing with, to make sure the church can engage, can connect, can look relevant as it is, be part of its community in all of its diversity. That was a key finding from the study.
And your study also makes a really important point about how even before white settlement came to Australia, our Indigenous population already had a spirituality, and we already saw God doing amazing things in our nation during that kind of time. What did the survey indicate about people's interest and the importance they felt around having Indigenous representation within our churches and a consideration for that within the way we run a Sunday service, for instance?
Well, it was a key issue, and it's a key theme in the report, and one of those recommendations as well. We had the great input from Willie Dumas, who runs Gangala Church, and he, as an Indigenous leader, is connecting with a lot of Christian Indigenous leaders who really have such a perspective to bring the church and our nation at this point. But we just, in mainstream church, we can all think about our experience, probably very rarely hear an Indigenous voice. And this is at a time when our nation is trying to deal with reconciliation, and who but the church ought to be the leaders in reconciliation, because we have a gospel of reconciliation between God and humans, that vertical reconciliation. And from that, we are people of reconciliation in that horizontal sense. And in Australia, engaging with Indigenous leaders and communities and connecting is important. And we need the voice of our Indigenous church leaders to guide us in that regard. Willie made the great point of saying, when was the last time on a platform we heard from an Indigenous leader sharing the gospel or sharing input? And the fact is, he said there's lots of them there, but we're probably not focused on or working hard enough to engage with them in our Indigenous communities across our cities, by the way, not just in regional and remote areas. So that was a key focus of the report as well.
The size of the churches that we go to is also something that comes up, and the ability for a church not just to be a mass of numbers and a mass of attendees, but a group of people that actually do something to have unique community impact. What did the church leaders that you interviewed say about that? Did they think that there was some kind of ideal church size, or was it much more about what that group of people, whether they're small or large, what they actually do to connect to the suburbs, the cities that they exist in?
Well, exactly. It was more the latter, that the church is at its best when it's in all its shapes and sizes and really does connect with its community. We see that around the world. The body of Christ looks differently, whether you're in the back blocks of Africa or whether you're in a mega global city, as it should. And even across our diverse nation, the church is going to look differently if it's really connecting with its community and being the representative of Christ there in different parts of this land. This came through strongly from church leaders. We had Joel Abell, who knows what it's like to lead a megachurch, but is now in small church planting. And he was saying that he's finding that renewed hunger in the community to do church unplugged, to do small church and to really feel engaged. And I think post-COVID, that's really been the experience as well. Our nation has been blessed by and needs the mega churches. But as Melinda Dwight said from Alpha Australia, who works across almost all of our churches nationally, the mega churches are hard to replicate. If we want to see growth in Australia, it's not just about planting mega churches, it's actually about planting churches that are going to replicate and grow, and many of them might be smaller. Now, the model might be for, if you like, a hub and spoke church. It might have a larger church that's got some funds for some facilities, but many people as part of that will actually be gathering in smaller areas or gathering points from there, perhaps being able to share resources, perhaps having a central facility they can use for leadership training, but their experience might be a bit more localized. And we're seeing the exact same trend with how Australians shop. If we go back 10 or 15 years, it was all about heading to that big, massive Westfield, the shopping centre. The bigger, the better. It was a destination. We'd drive halfway across town to go there. Not so today. The main shopping experience of Australians is the local shopping strip. We've gone local once more because we actually want to get to know the local baker and butcher. We want to get that expression of local community, not just head off into a vast and anonymous shopping centre. And I think we're seeing the same response as Australians look to the church and look to authentic community.
COVID probably really has sped up some of these conversations and maybe made people realize in new ways how much they enjoy a more intimate experience of church, something that is more personal and private, even in a way, if you're doing it in a home context. Do you think that that's going to have a long-lasting impact on the way that church functions? Because as people have come to enjoy the PJs and cup of coffee on the couch experience of church, will we actually return to the buildings and the larger gatherings?
It's a great question, and it's what everyone is thinking through. We dug deep into this. And I should say, the methodology here was we interviewed 34 church leaders, pastors, and ministry leaders for this. And so we got the sense of the leaders. But we then surveyed more than 1,000 Australian church goers. And so we got the sense of what it's like in the pews as well. And what we found is that the future of our church in Australia will be hybrid. Very few churches will now want to cut the feed on that online church because they really have found how beneficial it has been. We surveyed Nicky Gumbel as part of this, and he said that he's finding through Alpha Online, so many people attending even Alpha courses and an online church. He calls them the Zacchaeus group. They want to see Jesus, but they don't want Jesus to see them. They're sort of hiding up the tree. And so they're on Zoom, cameras off, mics off, but they're tuning into the gospel, to services, because they want to see what this Christianity thing is all about. Now, they were never going to have the courage to head into maybe a church with all of its strange language and weird practices, but they can click on a link and watch church online. As well, we've got, parents with young children that just can't get around to church. We've got those with mobility issues. We've got older Australians. We've got people maybe from other religions or searching or seeking that can't possibly get out and walk into a church, but the gospel is coming to them. And as Nicky Gumbel said, the Holy Spirit is not confused by Zoom, and just as the early church planners, take Paul the Apostle, used Roman roads and new ships and common language of Greek to see the spread of the gospel. Now we're using Zoom and Facebook Live and WhatsApp to connect, and it's having some great impact. But we also found that Australians are saying they're looking to get back to church as they knew it, where they can connect. In fact, the biggest challenges of COVID-safe church, Australians said, was not being able to mingle before or after the services. And second, socially distanced seating where you just don't get the fellowship, not having food, which is a key part of how we connect as Australians and as the body of Christ, and not being able to sing. These were great challenges. And so we are looking forward to getting back to that community and connection as we knew it, but we will still be keeping the live stream going as well. And what it will mean is that we will have a bit more regular church attendance. We've been seeing over the last few years that those who went weekly are sometimes going more like fortnightly now, and the fortnightlies were going monthly. It'll allow us to actually go weekly, maybe fortnightly or monthly in terms of a physical gathering, but in the off weeks or if something's on or we're juggling this or that, we can tune in online. And I think that's going to be a blessing for all. And we asked this question as well, what sort of services did you like with your online viewing? And 2/3 of churchgoers who've been online said that they preferred the live stream over the pre-recorded service. In other words, they want a sense of that authenticity, even though it might be in an online sense. And 2/3 as well, 63% prefer a low-key online service rather than a big production. So we want authenticity. We want our local service. We don't need to spend the mega bucks to have the big stage and the set. We want that authenticity, but to be able to access it through effectively functioning online service.
It has been really one of the upsides of COVID that you don't have to feel bad, particularly I think of the parents with young kids who have that moment where you rock up to church late, you're trying to quietly find a seat in the back and it just feels horrible, but you feel like, you need to be at church on a Sunday. It's made it okay to engage digitally, to engage online. It's a totally acceptable way to experience your faith and then also jump in person when you can. And I think with that, there's probably an individual ownership that a lot of people have had to take over their own faith, because you can't rely on your minister necessarily to be there face to face with the cup of tea having a chat after the service. You've got to look after and steward your own faith. Has that been what you've seen in the report, that people are more encouraged and confident to share their faith on their own and not rely on some of the big leaders to do it instead?
Well, that's exactly right. And this was one of the great positive findings from this research. It's been a tough year and suddenly churches not operating the way we knew it, and we couldn't volunteer in our roles and we couldn't connect up perhaps in the home group as we used to. So the big question is, how did Australian churchgoers find this year spiritually? Well, the amazing news is that 76% of Australian churchgoers said that this year has been a year of spiritual growth for them. Only 26% said that it's been a year of spiritual dryness. So we're 3 times as likely to have said, actually, we grew this year. And often, and we know this biblically, the persecutions and tough times, hardships and difficulties do strengthen our faith, because when we're weak in ourselves, then we're strong in Christ. And we found that through this research as well. And partly in digging out what the reason for this was, and it's, as you alluded, Laura, that people had to take a bit more responsibility for their own faith. 84% of churchgoers said they've taken greater responsibility for their own spiritual growth. They couldn't just rely on maybe their Bible study leader or their pastor or a mentor. They had to get into the word themselves, discipline themselves in their own prayer life. 62% said it's made them more active in ministry because they couldn't rely on the paid church staff to organize the Bible study group or to organize an outreach event. So it's amazing how this has worked out. It's almost been a little mini reformation, putting the tools of ministry back in the hands of the lay people and reminding us that we are the body of Christ. We don't sit back and pay people to do God's ministry. We're all priests and pastors in that sense.
Yeah, now I know we've only got a few minutes left here, and I'm hoping we can get across the 3 particular questions that I'm hoping to ask you. But the first one of that is that you've kind of got a society where, as we've mentioned, Christianity, church, it's a little bit on the nose. People don't want to engage in it in that way necessarily, in that every week context. But in times of crisis, as we've seen with COVID, as we see when there's any kind of natural disaster, the church is still a place and a group of people that people will rely on when things go wrong. They turn to the church. How do you think we can do better at not just being a place of connection in crisis, but also a friend in the everyday?
Yeah, that's so important. And firstly, in a crisis as we've had, and in these new times of uncertainty and complexity and volatility, people do look for something more grounding in their life. They look beyond just everything else that seems to be fading and job uncertain and stock market volatile. And of course, as people of faith, as people that have built our life on a timeless truth and on the rock, we know that you need something more than the shifting sands of our society. 57% of Australians said that 2020 has been the most difficult year of their life. I mean, that's a lot of struggle and uncertainty out there. And of course, we at the church have a hope and have a message and have good news to share. And I think it's important that we do that. And as you say, in these times and in everyday times, we need to be that. What we found in this research is that Australians are finding fewer of those community connections now. A lot of other social structures in society, organisations, even just knowing our neighbours, even those ad hoc connections where we were part of a local gathering group, have faded in a lot of people's lives. We move more frequently. A lot more people live in apartments and townhouses, just don't know their neighbours as much. We rent more, not just own. And so there's a lot more shifting, people moving jobs more frequently. So where are we getting community? Well, one of the few expressions of community that still exists is the church. The base of volunteers that is the backbone of our society in meeting the social needs, the support, the help, the health and welfare of our society is the church. And of course, its primary mandate of bringing spiritual answers to our society. So now is the time for the church not to step back, but to step forward. We had a great conversation with Steve Chong, who runs the Rice Movement across Australia, and he had this great phrase. He said, "Church, unmute yourselves." We've been in a time where so often we're on Zoom, as you and I did a moment ago, Laura, and you're saying, "Mark, you're on mute." Unmute yourself. We need to say that to the church. Now's the time to be clear in your voice, to be clear in your connection, to unmute yourself, and to speak into the needs of our society because they need it more than ever.
If we are going to speak up, though, you do need good leaders. And I think for the church to continue into the future healthily, we need good leaders. Now is a really tough time to be a church leader, though. The reputation of the church is tarnished. There can be so much more exposure and scrutiny on your life depending on the size of the congregation that you lead. What did the leaders that you surveyed, what did they say about how to raise up the next generation of leaders well, taking some of those things into consideration?
Well, they said that, we have to look at our traditional model. I mean, they're big supporters of Bible colleges that are doing fantastic things. But if all we're doing is equipping people with more information, as one of the interviewees said, and we're not focused on the application, that can be a problem because knowledge can puff up. We need the knowledge, but we need, in other words, it was well expressed in the report, we need leaders of head, so they've got the theological understanding, but of heart, so they're passionate about their call, and of hands, so they understand the practical skills, the people skills of engaging. And we found as well that the leaders of the future, we need to make sure we're connecting with the next generation because they know their culture and their peers better than we do. We need to make sure that we've got women as well as men. In the Bible, we see the Aquilas and the Priscillas. We see the Pauls and the Lydias, of course. And we need to make sure that we are consciously focused on equipping the leaders who can speak into their communities, leaders of different cultural backgrounds, leaders that understand their geography and not just bringing a city-centric or Anglo perspective to everything. This was really clear. And so, and that might mean that we've got different pathways. Maybe some are going through Bible college, maybe others are more engaged in leadership development from a mentoring or almost like an apprenticeship model, just as we have in mainstream society. Some young people finish school and go to university and get a degree, and others go through vocational education and pick up a trade. And both are key for our nation's skills, and both styles, if you like, are key for the church as well. And thirdly, we found in this that a lot of people ought to just understand God's call for where they are planted, rather than, I guess, pull someone who's maybe in business or the arts or politics, pull them into professional paid clergy. Maybe what we want to do is equip them for where God has placed them and planted them. In other words, making clear God's call for them where they're planted, rather than thinking that everyone has to go into full-time professional paid pastoral ministry.
It's a really subtle but a really important shift in perspective. But when we do get all of these things in place, the church is thriving, we've got those great leaders, everybody's geared up and amped to evangelize. How open are Australians to receiving the message of the gospel and considering the messages, the idea of Jesus?
Well, very open is our research. We consistently find, and even that data shows, that Australians are, if we've got half of the population identifying with Christianity, I mean, that's pretty phenomenal. And the majority of Australians, more than 7 in 10, believe in God. And then you've got the very strong warmth towards Jesus Christ as a person. Now, most Australians may not know the full details of Jesus, his ministry, and of course, the gospel message, but they're warm towards Jesus. If there are hang-ups, it's towards the church. As Todd Sampson said, if we've ever seen him on Gruen, he was looking at some of this data once, and he said, in commercial language, he said, what we have here, Australians like the product, they just don't like the retail outlet. They're great with Jesus, but it's the retail outlet, it's the communication channel that's been the problem. And I think the church is dealing with that and is being authentic and being focused on meeting the needs of our society and speaking the language of our society, not changing the timeless truth, but changing the means by which we engage. And I think that's important as well. So the outcome of this, the future of the church in Australia, is that it's a bright future. I mean, Jesus said himself that the gates of Hades won't prevail against the church. It's his church and he will build it. And with that empowerment, of course, the church will go well. But we're also seeing leaders adapt and change, connect, understand their community, speak authentically into it, and bring in that next diverse generation of leaders, all of which I think is going to have impacts across the diverse communities that we call Australia.
Yeah, well, Mark, thank you and your team for doing some amazing work pulling all of this research together. And thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Laura.